Welcome to the Near Memo, a weekly conversation about search, social, and commerce. What happened, why it matters, and the implications for local.
So, okay, let's talk about the third item here, which is an article that you read about how news in general, and maybe local news in particular, is kind of regressing to some earlier state of development, or the conditions of local news promotion are different, have changed.
The title of the article at Semaphore was "It's Back to the Future for Diminished Digital News Businesses." Basically, the lead was the BuzzFeed sort of crash and burn, and how news businesses that relied on Facebook for their distribution of news and readership have largely failed. And that included Insider and Vice and a number of others. And that to some extent, it's very much what's happened is those businesses, those news businesses that went slow and steady, built their own base, had good homepage visits, had user communities and commenting communities on their blogs, and had perhaps private or public emails. Those news businesses have grown reasonably successfully. And we've seen in the case of the New York Times, Washington Post, where they can take their own advertising and have a big enough readership, those have grown successfully. So it's sort of with the end of Facebook, not just no longer highlighting news, but no Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, none of those are highlighting external links at all, right? So there's this shift in social media, and it points out the problem of relying on these players for your future, trying not back to the whole topic of owning your own presence, but it really, for me, raises the question of how should local news lean into this new reality, and how should local businesses lean into it, and how should it change their view of where they should be putting their efforts? Like this woman who's on Instagram that how vulnerable is she to Facebook in this context, and is she doing the things to protect her future, like getting emails?
That's the old advice is build your own list, right?
That is your old advice, and clearly these guys for the last 10 years relied on Facebook, and now they've gone off in a puff of smoke.
The sort of the hype cycle around newsletters appears now to be over, but the engagement rates with email have remained very consistent all the way through the pandemic and the rise of social media and everything else. Like, email open rates are still the same. And if you're putting out quality content, which many of these sites are, you absolutely should be trying to own that audience, and thinking about the newsletter itself as a serious vehicle for ad revenue opportunities, whether that's just straight up display advertising or sponsored content. There's all kinds of opportunities that newsletters open up, and to an extent that social media just does not allow for. The display ads are going to somebody else's pocket, Facebook, Twitter, whoever. And there isn't really a great way to do sponsored content through a tweet. I mean, I suppose you could just label it as sponsored, but that in and of itself seems to depress engagement across, not having a context. So I just think there's many, many, many opportunities for publishers to maybe go back to the future in, the year 2000, before social media existed, where email was really the dominant mechanism to get the word out about your content.
Great.
Well, I think the whole topic of local news is a really important one, and a very complicated one. I mean, I think David's advice is exactly right. You've got to build your own audience. I mean, in fairness to all these guys, there's no way that rewind however many years, a decade, that any of these news publications, the explosion of social media, that just seemed like the right strategy. You've got to be present on social media. That seemed like a smart strategy. And then obviously it deteriorated, especially as Facebook started throttling organic reach for advertising revenue. And there's a separate conversation about sort of the deterioration of these public companies as they need to grow revenue and do more and more things to monetize their traffic. It's allergy season. I'm having problems here. So, but I think there are some interesting isolated examples of local news that seem to be succeeding, but it's very hard for anybody
Yeah.
to emulate the New York Times and the Washington Post as
Right.
major national publications. I mean, I'm subscribed to the San Francisco Chronicle, which is the local publication here, and I engage with that mostly through I have the app on my phone, but mostly I'm engaging with that content through Google News, the news aggregator. So I don't think there's an easy answer here, but the advice that you have to build your own audience, you have to build your brand, is exactly right. At one point, newspapers were sort of playing with the idea of being local business directories as well. There was some effort for newspapers either to build standalone directory websites. I think that happened in a few instances, or to kind of embed a local business directory in their newspaper website. And they probably don't have the resources and the wherewithal to do that today. But it's an interesting opportunity if somebody could execute against that. Just sort of a vetted list of really high quality businesses in different categories. I mean, that's what Nextdoor should be, but Nextdoor it's really disappointing to me every time I go there. Every time I go there for some, legitimate business search, I have to turn away and shake my head. It's just
Greg, the key there is if you have expectations as low as I do, that you won't be disappointed when you go and try those searches. So
it's such a missed opportunity for them,
Yep.
But Mike, any final thoughts on?
No, I don't know. You've answered my question.
I wanted to add something, which is, I think that there is an opportunity for local I won't say newspapers anymore, local media in large enough urban markets, I think, to leverage crowdsourcing of sort of maybe part-time journalists. I mean, Greg, you were talking about these folks on TikTok, that aren't necessarily journalists, but are talking about local school board meetings and that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
There may be a way for them to sort of crowdsource some of the content generation that they would sort of extend, the life of a TikTok video on their own platform or within their own app or what have you. I'm thinking about it from a sports standpoint. I mean, there's several independent writers who cover the Portland Trail Blazers. The Athletic does a great job, in terms of their beat writers. There's got to be a way to sort of tie this sort of, licensed content from solopreneurs who are focused on a particular topic, and cut them into a larger audience, where I don't know that that's possible in a truly small market where you don't necessarily have the same. There just aren't enough eyeballs to make a go it alone subscription newsletter viable. And so I don't know what that means for sort of smaller rural markets, which have already been decimated by, local papers, closing or cutting back, with whether it's Gannett or McClatchy or Knight Ridder or any of these Lee Enterprises. Like, I think these guys are all cutting their local rural papers back considerably. So,
well, you need a different business model in those environments, right? In a major metro where you have more people and more options, you can do certain kinds of things. And in a smaller market, it maybe needs to be supported by, maybe it's a nonprofit that's philanthropically supported and people just recognize it's important for the community to have a news source. Mike, you were going to add something.
I was just going to say it's a federated model of operating that David is proposing. That is an interesting idea for particularly mid-major markets that don't have a Washington Post or New York Times or San Francisco Chronicle. It's an interesting idea.
Well, great. What's your opinion of the quality of the Chronicle these days?
Well, so for certain things, it's okay. For certain kinds of content, it's useful. And there's a longer discussion to be had about some of these issues that we've raised and their viability. I mean, I think back to the first item, there's the trust factor that the local media brand still has, and that gives them certain opportunities that they may or may not be able to exploit because of resources. But we're out of time for today, and we'll come back to these topics, of course, again and again. Thanks for joining us. Tune in next week where our guest will be Claire Carlisle, who'll be talking about GBP is a CMS and have a lot of great tactical and practical information there. David will be on vacation next week in Ireland, I think, right?
Yes.
I will be a week from today. I will be at St.
Play
Patrick's in Rosapena. Yes.
Golfing. Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, have a great trip, and we will see you next week.
Thanks for joining David, Mike, and Greg. To stay on top of the latest developments in local, subscribe to our newsletter at nearmedia.co. We'll see you next week.